think about what we know or what we don't know drives what we feel. And what we feel is how confident or unconfident we are. And this feeling then leads us to actions. And those actions have ramifications. So just a couple of examples of that, obviously, overconfidence, just driven by some of these issues, leads us to occasionally excessive risk-taking, over-trading. Underconfidence can also lead us to non-investment. So for example, low literacy, low knowledge can lead us to non-investment. So what David's really getting at is at the core of why we feel and why we act in our space. So it's really getting to the bottom of some of the core of what causes us to have different effects in our industry. So as a result, I was very delighted to moderate this panel, and I thought I'd start off by hitting a couple of key areas of application within our panelists. So as a group, given the demographics of the individuals at this conference, one of the first areas that came up when we discussed was models and how we see the world. And I think this is particularly important in finance because so much of what we do is a construct. And honestly, in finance, we know so little about what is really ahead of us. And we have a very difficult task with that. So I want to start by turning to our panelists to talk a little bit about how they think about models and how they think about conceptualizing what they know and what they don't know and the implications of that. So Mick, would you like to start?
Sure. In my role in Abbey Capital, we're a multi-manager allocator, so I suppose we stepped a little bit between these two worlds. And it was really interesting this morning to hear a lot of the comments around the difficulty of really around modeling and of really forecasting the future, because our primary role is looking at managers and therefore looking at the managers and looking at their models. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot with our clients is the sense of the evolution and the work that goes into creating the models, the ongoing every day is a new learning, every day is a new piece of data. But ultimately, when we allocate and invest, we're looking at the quantitative and also the qualitative side. And when money goes to work, you are effectively investing in the relationship as well. And I can say over the last 20 years, that's always an interesting journey. It's always fraught with difficulty as it's ups and downs, people evolve and change. So I think from our perspective, we're always interested in the parallel journey of both the model development and the learning that happens, but equally the qualitative development of how people go through life, deal with the changes, deal with the highs, but most importantly, deal with the lows and the challenges is much more important to building a long-term relationship with the manager when you have an expectation of returns. Given that we're both, and to some extent it comes across today very strongly, is we're both in this together and we both don't know an awful lot about the future.
Okay, maybe I want to turn Roy to you. Do you want to comment on models and how you conceptualize those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I'll share something that kept going through my mind as I was hearing David speak, which is, so I'm one of the co-founders and the CIO of Brett & Hill, so we're a quant team inside Neuberger Berman now, and we've got 22 quants on my team. And so I kept thinking about how you build out a team. And the way we've approached things, which I think we had some gut instinct as to why we like this, but maybe you've helped solidify a bit, is we've really tried to build out a team where people have different backgrounds. And I actually know when we interview someone who's come from a mathematical finance background, I know exactly how they're going to tackle problems. I know that they're going to come in and we're immediately going to see a bunch of Garch model estimates for volatility and so on. And I know when people come through a finance program, how they're going to tackle things. They're going to look at a bunch of regressions against factors. And so we've tried, and all that's valuable, but we've tried to build out, we've got 2 neuroscience PhDs. We've got one person that's a PhD in experimental physics. My background was actually, my PhD is in medical imaging. We've cobbled together a team with a whole bunch of different backgrounds. And part of it is a patch for all the things that you might not know, because I know that we all are bringing our biases to the table. And so that's, I think, been really effective, but I'll also share one challenge we've had in doing that, which is in starting a business 6 years ago, it means, and a business that's been growing, it means we've been hiring 2 or 3 people every year. And the last real market crisis we had was over 10 years ago. And so one of the things that I guess it's my job and the other partners' jobs to bring to the younger folks is they really have some lack of knowledge or instinct as to what a market crisis even is. Because I guarantee that when you look at a back test and you see a dip and then a recovery, it doesn't really feel like that in practice. In practice, the dip feels much worse, and yes. Especially if you don't know that there's a subsequent rapid recovery. And so I think a lot of your comments help sort of solidify how we think about building out a team that fills in all the gaps around the biases and lack of knowledge that any of us might actually bring.
So, David, thank you, by the way, for your talk this afternoon. After this morning's talk, I was semi-despondent. I'm a market neutral equity manager, and I learned this morning there was A, no opportunities, and B, machine learning was never going to save me. But now my confidence has been restored. As long as people are involved in making financial decisions, there will be lots of inefficiencies to exploit. So thank you for that.
As long as we're not the idiots.
Well, you never know who the greater fool is, right? So with regards to modeling and how one approaches that, I'll tell you our philosophy, or my personal philosophy, is, look, you start by accepting that anytime you create a model, you're making a simplified representation of the real world, okay? By definition. So that means you're leaving out dynamics, you're leaving out processes that are messy, complicated, and hard to deal with, and trying to capture whatever the core effect you're doing. So when you do that, if you fail to recognize that that is what you're doing, and then build around your model analytics that help you identify, hey, when is the model not capturing what's actually happening, and it's displaying behavior that's outside of what you sought to capture, you will get yourself in trouble really quickly. So the process of modeling in my world involves, creating the models, but also creating the bits that help trap when your model might be hypocognitive.
Mm-hmm. Actually, David, I wanted to add one more point to that. My favorite story related to things in finance where we don't think about is emotion. And actually, we don't talk a lot about how we feel in finance, but how we feel is actually extremely important. So let me give you one study that made me think about David's work. In 2012, Lee and Schwartz did a study of investment where they exposed investors to the smell of fish. Now, it may seem a little silly, but they were testing the classic adage, something smells fishy. And what they found is that investors were much less likely to invest in the presence of fish than they were without fish, which basically exposed the point that we are often unaware of some of the things that we are influenced by within the decisions we make in finance. So that was I now have a concept to understand that. And for model building for us, or at least the way I think about it, is that I have been fascinated with systematic trading because it allows us to make those decisions without those impulses. So to create a model where the models at least are trying to help us to avoid those moments where things are making us make decisions that we're unaware of. I know for many of you out there who are systematic, you probably have that experience when you talk to discretionary traders. I find it very difficult because I don't know what is driving all of their decisions. So for me, models is a way to solve that problem, but it creates a whole new can of worms where we don't know where we may be making some mistakes. So given that, and I liked your point about machine learning, maybe we can also turn to discuss a little bit about how this relates to machine learning, how this relates to the area of data, and what the future holds in terms of how we're going to over-process and over-deliver with data, or how machine learning, for example, may be an avenue where we could fall into the same traps that we're concerned about. So I can start at the end. Any of you guys want to take a shot at that?
I do want to take a shot at that, essentially because the area I know the best between psychology and the real world is psychology and law. And to my surprise, machine learning is making its introduction to the law right now. And the issue, however, for the law is that, especially if you're using machines that use neural nets, what you're having are machines that come to conclusions without transparency. No one knows why the machine is deciding that this person is likely to be dangerous and that person is likely to be safe. That person it cannot get parole, that person can get parole. And it matters because companies are being sued as to why their machine made the call, and the company has to say, we have no idea how the machine made the call. And that's turned out to be of very much concern in the law. But I was also thinking about that this morning when we were talking about machine learning, which is, of course, there is the large scope of ignorance that we have in the world, and we might actually be active agents in actually producing more of it, at least the current machine learning technology that we have. We're now creating machines that reach decisions we don't know why.
Well, one interesting thing, early days of facial recognition, for example, right? The way these processes work is you create training data sets where humans identify whatever the particular feature you're trying to identify, whether it's a human face or a cat or a dog or whatever it is. And an interesting thing happened as those processes started getting going is that because humans were creating the training data, human biases crept into the results that initially came out. And lo and behold, we had machine learning that was much better at identifying wide angle faces than, say, Native American or some other ethnicity. And so you can clearly see where the humans can make the problem worse, and now we have machines working at machine scale and doing it just better, faster, cheaper. But then there are ways around those traps, whether by getting better input data is one method. Other methods are stress testing the results. And there's been great progress in that, but it's still a pitfall.
Yeah, I'd rather make a comment around the data rather than the techniques that you use to analyze the data. I think the number one problem I feel like we face was represented by that picture this morning, where the car became exceptionally snowy. And some people say markets are tough to beat because they're so efficient, and maybe that's true. But I think they're also very tough to beat because they're so noisy. And so that picture, to be sort of summarized it, even though I'm from Canada and that's what it's like sometimes to drive in winter. But in our case, when you have data that messy, the two solutions are go out and find more data to try and build more ways to corroborate your views. And so I disagree a bit with the panelists from earlier this morning, where I agree that there is lots of hype around alternative data sets that will fall short of expectations. But I also think that even incremental amounts of predictive power are really helpful. And we've had real situations where with credit card data, for example, we were able to see the decline in airline revenues last fall, even though they didn't really guide lower until January. We were able to see that Macy's sales were falling off a cliff within days of the holiday season. And all that information is really valuable to include in a process. So I guess I'm more of a realist, where I think that there's lots of hype, but there is actual content too. And I think the other way to solve that noisy problem is to figure out how you impose your prior views and your framework on top of that data. And we all do that. And I think your research gives us some warnings about exactly how we do that. Exactly. But when you have that much noise, you have to have prior views. And I'll tell you right now, I looked at some of the slides that were in the very first presentation, which I thought was really interesting. And I would right away say, I bet that the short-term mean reversion factor never comes back. And I bet we can see the value factor make money again. So right off the bat, I know I've got my biases. And I think part of being an investor with fund managers is to figure out what are the experiences that led for this organization, this culture to have the biases they have. What are those biases? And are you comfortable that those biases are not actually a negative in making money, but they're actually a positive because they bring some structure and framework to a really noisy problem?
From a slightly different perspective on it, again, from an allocation viewpoint, I think as Michael said this morning about machine learning being the very strong buzzword. So everywhere you go, it's like, what are you doing with machine learning? Is this the next great thing? And as always, the market runs ahead of itself, and to some extent, we find that managers tend to follow that and try and create a narrative or build a narrative that answers that question. So there's an element of where expectations become unreasonable, and I think some of the work this morning did highlight the weaknesses in that. But often, you as a manager, or as an allocator, or as an investor, may not have the time to look at that or to digest that. So, I suppose we see it as in terms of it's definitely it's not on the doorsteps, as it were. It's definitely on people's mindset. And you know, with the whole Internet of Things, it's everything can come at you in terms of what are you doing in machine learning, what are your managers seeing in machine learning, what are they doing. You know, we see it from an investment point of view. We like the more oversight within the machine learning piece. But I think definitely there's a risk that we get a little bit too far ahead, and that investors are looking for something that may not be actually there right now, or also can be quite difficult to explain. And I think, again, for us, when we allocate, it's always, can we get this across simply or sophisticated simply, as I said this morning? Absolutely. Can we understand it ourselves first? And sometimes it can come across from managers that there isn't a real strong narrative to explain, and that can be quite off-putting if it's not robust enough in that respect.
If I could just add a comment on implementation too that I think is relevant. So what do you do when you have something new that you're implementing where you might not know all of the things you don't know? I think you actually fall back on sort of money management 101. Why do I like notional limits rather than risk model-based limits? Because it can't really go wrong. Why do lots of traders, including myself, have a bias toward stop losses? Because there's lots of times where you can run really good back tests, and a stop loss doesn't actually help you, because the back test you have, of course it works. Of course it works over the past 30 years. Of course, buying on the dip is better for something that works rather than unwinding risk on the dip. But what does the stop loss do? It protects you from all of the things that you actually don't have in your back test, but that might actually exist in the future. So I think there are some situations like that where there's concrete quantitative answers to protect against some of the risks that you just talked about.
So given that, let's turn to this point of hypocognition to hypercognition. And I think for finance, this is a really interesting point, because 50% is the maximum overconfident point. So if you're dealt with something that you have 50% accuracy of choosing it, you're going to be the most overconfident relative to what you think. So if you think about what we all do, every day we're dealing with something that's very close to a 50-50 chance. Whereas humans, on the other hand, when we're very accurate, we can become underconfident and actually underestimate how good we are at categorizing things we think we know. So the challenge being that when we're new to something, we have very little information, we can be less confident and also less accurate. But as we build experience, we become hypercognitive and then become overconfident relative to our accuracy. And eventually with experience, we converge to being a little bit more rational, but still overconfident, as you saw from David's graphs over there. So how do you think about this voyage within your experience in terms of, I know Roy talked a little bit about this with the new people that you bring into your team, because you know that they have that journey ahead of them. How do you think about the aspects of both hypocognition to hypercognition? How does that relate to how you think about investment?
I'm very confident I have some valuable points to add to this. I've been on several panels before, so yeah. Yeah, no, I can really easily see how it creeps into investment processes. And here's some of the things we've tried to do, just from a practical perspective. So one of the things that I found really valuable is that, first of all, everything we do is systematic. So in the end, we really like to have some fundamental insights, but then say, okay, how can we really systematize them and build it into a tight process? But there's a couple of things we do. So on the one hand, every time we screen for securities, we also have a 37-person fundamental team. And we actually go through that security before we purchase it and periodically when we own it. And we make sure that we are properly mapping that security onto the various factors that are the reasons why we're buying it, with the fundamental analyst that is talking to the treasurer and following that name and making sure that there's not something about how this company reports that makes it not comparable to its peers. There haven't been some sort of corporate action or other event that makes it no longer applicable. And so I feel like there's times, and maybe this addresses some of the disappearance of alpha argument this morning. I feel like there's times when we identify places where we actually have the opposite views of typical quants, like a few weeks ago with WellCare, where we felt like we knew that WellCare had a one-time Obamacare fee. It had early receipt of Medicaid premiums that made its cash from operations not comparable to its peers. And so we were long and others were short. So I still feel like there's a lot of situations where if you bring in knowledge from others, it helps fill in the gaps that we might not have. And so that's important. And everything we try to do is basically, how can you set up processes that try to catch all the things that as a quantitative investor, the normal historic approach might be to diversify away all the mistakes that you know are in your many assumptions in your models and your data. But I think through over-diversification, we get the results we saw in the first presentation of the day. So the question is, how can you build processes that mean that you don't actually have to over-diversify when you build names? And that's one of the ones that we've had some success with.
You know, I've run into this issue maybe in a slightly different kind of way, which I think gets to your, I think what's behind your choices in hiring, which is, you'll put somebody trained in a particular way of doing things and put them on a problem. And the more technical, the deeper their experience is, the more likely they're to come back to you with this incredibly beautiful, mathematically elegant, incredibly complicated solution to the problem, right? And they get so enthralled with the beauty of what they're doing that they lose track of the objective, right? It's kind of forest through the trees kind of thing. And this is a form of overconfidence, in this case in the technique rather than the results, that can be a problem in a systematic quantitative kind of process. And it's a real problem. My choice always, if I can pick the bit too clever solution or the robust solution, I'd rather go the robust way. But that's not always what my people want to do.
I like that. I've had some colleagues, I call it precisely incorrect and imprecisely correct.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose from my perspective, I thought, chatting to David recently and just reading some of his work was really interesting and highlights, again, which for all of us are our inherent biases. So it's part of life is recognizing them, staring them down a bit. But, when we look at, say, I think one of the speakers this morning said, you never see a bad hypothetical track record. So, immediately, you see something new, it looks interesting, and there you go. And I think we've tried to, over the years, try to sort of see it in terms of, when we look at managers, look to stay with managers for the long term, and to see, do we have a conviction around the strategy, conviction around the people, and ultimately size to stay with them through all weathers. And, but that all changes the minute you put the money to work. And it's, then it's sort of open season. And things happen. Things happen, as I said in my open comments, things happen in firms, in people's lives, but in markets, they change constantly. And, for any investor, that's what you're effectively buying into, no matter what the strategy is. And I think that sense of confidence that we see in David's work is right. We see the elements of overconfidence. We send the reality. We're normally taught best about reality when we go through difficult periods. When we get it handed back to us and it's tough, we do much better learning and in those environments, and that's reasonable to take. So I think we see it as that term of how can we stay with people going through tough periods, and do we understand why? And that gives us great conviction with our managers. And I would say nobody has ever disappointed us in terms of what could possibly go wrong in a track record. Stuff happens. And part of the great learning there is when there is an honesty about that, like learning. And we talked a bit about that in David's presentation, about that sense of in the medical profession not seeing where the accidents can be. But it's almost I always think a dose of humility is very healthy when you're trying to solve these type of problems. But it takes a long time to get there for all of us.
See, the funny thing is, I think people outside this room would say quantitative investing, that's all about the models. But I think we are all saying it's actually about the people.
To a large extent.
So given that, I thought I'd turn a question on David on this one too. Thinking from hypocognition to hypercognition, how do you resolve that concept relative to some of the things we learn about gut feelings, or about this idea that, and there's been some research that shows that
individuals are actually better without using probabilistic reasoning to solve complex problems using those type of approaches. So the question is how do you compare those two approaches? How does that fit into this whole literature of how our gut feelings help us solve problems better than, say, when we know more and we use a complex approach? How do you put that into that?
Well, I think the research field has given an incomplete answer on that. Because I think as I'm listening to people's commentary here, I'm struck by the fact that sometimes life really presents you not one answer but two answers depending on who you're talking to. For example, in the systematizing everything, all the data that you can get about various investment opportunities you're thinking about, you're really drawing them into what Warren Buffett refers to as the circle of competence. That is, you really know this stuff. You really educate yourself about this stuff. You have a diversity of people analyze this stuff from the way that they look at it, so that you have completely surrounded the problem and know as much as possible there is to know about the problem. For experts who have the time to do that, and for whom that is the way to go about things, that is the, let's say, the fundamental prescription. Circle a problem, know as much as you can, analyze it from as many angles, make it part of your circle of competence. If you don't have that capability, if you don't have that those resources intellectually or financially, whatever, then what you need to do is you need to protect yourself from problems that you're never going to be able to see them coming. Diversify, for example, and don't think much about it, just diversify as much as possible. So there are often two different types of answers that you can give. Now, back to intuition. Intuition really works extremely well if you are a true expert. That is, if you are a true expert, you can easily analyze things and come to a very quick conclusion that will tend to be much more accurate than it would be if you thought about it. And maybe the best example of this from your everyday life would be face recognition. That is, you don't think your way to recognizing a person's face. You recognize the face automatically. That's because we're tremendous experts at facial recognition. We're overtrained like mad. If you are a true expert, then intuition can be a tremendously wonderful guide. If you're not a true expert, you may have intuitions, but it may be tremendously misguiding. And so there you do want to think things through. So there are people for whom intuition is very useful. There are other people for whom intuition can be actually quite damaging in some respects. The trick is knowing whether you're in the first group or the second group. I guess there is sort of an intellectual serenity prayer, in some sense. Know what I'm smart about, know what I'm not smart enough, and be wise enough to know the difference. There is a difference, but you have to really pay attention to, am I really an expert? Have I paid my dues? Or do I have an intuition that really I should give pause to?
Can I tie that to a machine learning point?
Go ahead.
Perhaps an interesting way. So that expert who's super well trained on whatever the topic is, facial recognition or whatever, ask him in the moment, yes or no, red or blue, whatever, give you the answer, if it's truly an intuitive thing, they really can't tell you what motivated that answer. Mm-hmm. Okay? And how is that different from a very well-trained neural net that becomes so complicated that you can't tell what the inputs are? Both these are, one's a biological neural net, the other one is a computational neural net. Mm-hmm. They're both highly complicated machines, mm-hmm. and they become opaque at some level of complexity.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. But the difference is, I typed an email to a client the other day that said, "Hi, Vanita," and then my autocorrect changed it to "Hi, Fajita," and the expert will catch the common sense.
Interestingly, maybe, right? Because we've all had that experience, mm-hmm. and then you reread the email, and sometimes you catch it. Sometimes your brain sees it as a valid word, just like another, and you skip it. And so maybe you catch it. The other point is, I would suggest is, we still don't have neural nets, computational neural nets, at the level that are competitive with humans. Mm-hmm. So it's perhaps a point in time thing.
So going on that, I thought I also might ask you one more question, David. We talk a lot about the individual. Mm-hmm.
how does this connect to the group? Because as we know in finance, we're all coming together to view the value of different assets. How do things like theory of mind and social networks, how do those combine at the aggregate level with thinking about hypocognition and hypercognition?
Well, in a very interesting way. That is, a group, a collective, whether you're talking about a business or you're talking about a political community or whatever, profits the best when it does have people who are coming from different intellectual backgrounds or different backgrounds and have different things to say about the conclusions that you might want to reach. So in psychology, one of the terms that's often talked about in organizational psychology is cognitive diversity. That's something you absolutely want. I assume it's not a surprising term to people in the room. The thing that I think is surprising about that, however, is you want cognitive diversity, but it turns out to be damn hard to achieve because people truly coming from different intellectual backgrounds are going to have a different language, they're going to have different values, they're not going to understand necessarily where people from other backgrounds are coming from. So you do have to spend a lot of time just sort of mapping out how to talk to one another. And for example, at Cornell, we're one of the few places where economists can talk to psychologists and psychologists can talk to economists. That took 20 years before we were stopped talking past one another. But one of the usual bromides in psychology is that if it's difficult, it's probably quite helpful. And this is another example of that, that if you can bring together network people from who have divergent expertise, can bring different viewpoints to bear on a problem, there are tremendous rewards to reap. The problem is it's going to take an awful lot of work to get there. And you just have to be aware of that.
Okay, so then, as one, given the time, I want to ask one more question, just kind of to bring it back to where we started, and then we can hopefully let the audience ask some questions in a minute as well. So finally, how do you think about, for all of us here in the investment space, how do we think about communicating to clients? And what are some of the things that are important in terms of helping clients? Because one of your last points was really about the nurses and how their constituents didn't really understand the complexity of the issues that they're dealing with. So how do you, in your day-to-day, think about this issue, and what steps do you take to try and help with this gap?
Yeah, I can give a quick example, which is I thought the tool that, was it Ewan that showed this morning? Scenario analysis is awesome. Because my experience is that clients come in and they really want to learn rules that are embedded in your process, but without the broader framework of all of the ways that those process rules might interact, they can really land on wrong conclusions. What they really want to know is what do outcomes look like? And so I think, in my experience, scenario analysis is something that really helps clarify that. And in fact, no matter how people are putting together portfolios, you can always back it out to some implied scenario views, and then you can talk with your clients about, here are the kinds of outcomes you can get under different situations, and we've had way better conclusions there. And then we've often found that after that scenario-based conversation, people can then walk through the various elements of our process with the right context to actually interpret it properly.
Yeah, so to add to that, I suppose, again, from our perspective, we find that communication is both a challenge and an opportunity for, especially in a very systematic or technical space. And there's always the danger across the client spectrum is people's perception of understanding of it until something is not working, and then it goes to zero very quickly. So it's fraught with challenges, and you're absolutely right in terms of one of the things we find works incredibly well is when we get a chance to show the process. So, you have your investment philosophy, but then if you show your process and the rigor and the rules around it, it becomes very real to somebody if they sit in the room and see that. I think that's incredibly valuable. But having said that, the way we communicate, messaging, written documents, papers, etc., as we all know, people are reading less stuff right now. It's attention spans are less, so I'm always unsure as to are people reading the stuff at all? And this doesn't matter what you're producing. So I think, education, re-education, reaffirming what the strategy is all about, and assuming that you're starting from scratch all over again is really important. I think in the industry we're in here, that it goes back to the DNA of the Bridge Group around managed futures. We're one of the most unusual strategies that we don't say what we're going to do in the future. When somebody asks, what's your expectation of performance? The honest answer is we don't know. And that creates a vacuum straight away. Now, a very interesting vacuum to jump into, but that is inherently honest and correct, and it's based, and everyone looks at the track record then. What have you done in the past? Can you do it in the future? And that's been a challenge for the industry in recent years because conviction levels are lower. As Ewan says earlier on, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. We're just not sure how that rhyme will sound. So I think, assume nothing on the communication and always the sense of making the case to prove. And it's always a challenge. And I think that's not going to go away.
Can I add one little thing and tied into those scenarios we looked at? It's also important, I think, to talk about scenarios that haven't happened. Because there's a problem of our own making that I've had to deal with lately too. And one of our funds is an alternative risk premium product, which I think we put a lot of research into it. We feel good about it. But investors in many cases were surprised that the space, including us, were down last year. And not even down badly, I would say sort of mid-single digits. And I realized one of the disconnects is that in my head, I've got a dozen scenarios where that kind of strategy can be down in a year. But I realized that all the clients have ever seen is back tests like the one you showed Ewan on trend following, and there the perception is this is really easy, it makes money every year, what's going on? And so I think we have to, as a community, do a little better job of bridging that gap.
I will say that client communication, investor communication is perhaps even more challenging than uncovering new alpha. And the real problem that I've dealt with is how do you take a pretty complicated, perhaps non-intuitive process and really transfer that understanding, right? I mean, they're not going to know every detail, but they should be able to walk away with an understanding, and it really forces you to really take a step back and understand where that person is, not just in their level of sophistication, but also what's in their head, what are their priorities, what are their biases coming into that conversation, and then framing the conversation around that. So it becomes very hard to have a standard pitch deck, right? You always have to have a one-on-one conversation, and it's a tough thing.
So then finally, David, do you have any advice for us on things to think about in those areas, or things that we may not be aware of that are perhaps useful?
Always ask about the alternative. Always ask about how things can be different. Always be wary of the 100% confident judgment. And I think people will be much better protected.
So given that, can we see if we have any questions here in the audience?
Professor Dunning, I'd be very interested to know in your research if you found a difference in generations, particularly with the millennial generation and related to the challenge of building your team. I'm seeing in my own observation that there might be a difference in generation.
We haven't yet. I mean, there are a number of things we have to look at yet. I mean, not only is there generation, there's just simply aging. And aging itself, or the life course itself, might have its impacts. But I can speculate, but I should speculate only after the second martini. But we haven't looked. But I think you pinpointed something that may matter a great deal. We haven't been able to paint the picture yet of how it does matter.
Hi, I have two separate questions. First one for David. I think you presented several or many cognitive biases. I think most of them have existed for a long time, probably because of our evolution. But earlier you also mentioned that lately people seem to believe less of experts. So it's a change of attitude, change of bias. So what do you think caused that change recently? Some of the biases, overconfidence, probably exists for thousands of years. But this recent change of less believing experts, how do we explain that?
Well, there are many explanations that are potentially out there, but no one exactly knows. I mean, the obvious culprit to point to is the internet, and the fact that now people can go and educate themselves, whether rightly or wrongly, about whatever topic they want to educate themselves about. And once again, in the area of medicine, this really does matter because a lot of people do self-diagnose off the internet and never go see a doctor. And that can present a problem because of those people actually then do actually go see a doctor. A third of the time, the diagnosis that they've come to is different from the one the doctor would have come to, for example. And there's also the bias of the internet to play up the importance of things. So often the internet will overstate, whether we're talking about something medical or non-medical, the consequences of the topic that the person is looking at. But no one, I think, has ever come to good and hard data about why we are living in the era that we're living in. And it may very well be that it has always been thus. And finally, we decided to look and to see. And that might be why we have, for example, the surprising finding that a third of Americans think they know just as much as the experts on autism, for example. No one's just ever bothered to ask the question before. We don't know if that might be an explanation for what's going on. But what we do know is there is the fact that people do believe that they can achieve levels of expertise that they really don't have. That clearly is a phenomenon that's been identified.
It's almost like information overloading. Too much information out there that causes confusion.
Well, I'll tell you, the World Economic Forum, I believe 5 years ago, identified, quote unquote, massive digital misinformation as a potential species-ending event or threat. Much like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So there is information overload, and there is a worry that it might result sooner or later in digital wildfires in terms of panics that may happen that actually have no basis in truth.
Thanks. So several questions for Katie and also for one of the panelists that would say model-based trading removes some of the subjective or emotional component to it. But as we know, building a model involves a lot of subjective judgment. And also models sometimes break. I'm not sure how many models you are using now are the same as they were 2 years ago. Or people constantly adjusting their models, decide this model is not working, let's try a new one. So in some way, I think whether that's just a different way of subjective selection. Choosing a model is not that different from choosing a manager, right? I'm not sure if you never stop using a model or decide this model is not working, lots of money, let me choose a better one. So in some way, the emotional or subjective component is always there, seems to me. I can be wrong. Whether you are discretionary traders or you are model-based traders. They're just in different form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I entirely agree that there's not enough good data that it clearly leads us to applying the scientific method in a way that will create alpha persistently. So what do you have to buy when the data is really noisy? You have to invest in managers where you also trust their priors and their experience, because in order to take that fuzzy car picture that we saw this morning and turn that into trades, you have to supplement that messy, noisy data with some sort of view. And a lot of that view comes from the underlying views of the managers. Now, I would still be of the view that we can eliminate through systematic trading a lot of the day-to-day biases. For example, we do natural language processing of earnings transcripts, and then we'll share that with our fundamental colleagues, and they tell us, this is actually pretty useful because I have a different view on how I interpret the bullish or bearishness of this earnings transcript that I read based on how I feel. And they say, I know if I read this next week, if I'm in a bad mood, it'll be more bearish. So I think we can actually get rid of some of those biases, but for sure, you're still inheriting the biases of the managers that are building the models and all of the assumptions that have to come with it. And then the question that you have to ask, I think, is that bias based on ignorance, in which case we're in all of this category that Dave's been describing, or are those biases based on experience, in which case I think we've got a shot.
No, but if a model has been making money for 2 years, and now it's not making money, how do you decide it's normal or it's broken? I mean, models are always not model. Some model can break. How do you decide between sort of
yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time just on that, but I would say this. Conceptually, what we try to do is a priori say what would be the conditions that would make us decide that this model isn't working. It's best if you can do that in advance, not
Not in the
when
moment.
you're worried about the model not working. Yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question for Professor Dunning. I was a little bit curious on the layman's impression of the role of data in science. And I'm wondering if they have a fundamental misunderstanding of the role that data plays, or if they understand the way that it's supposed to be done, that data is supposed to drive the analysis and you draw conclusions from that, and that they believe that scientists just aren't doing that. Was there a way to test for that, or did you guys look into that at all?
We have, but other people have. But actually, there's a third possibility, which is when people tend to think of science, they don't even think in terms of data. There's a developmental psychologist by the name of Andrew Schulman who's gone to people and asked them, do you believe in oxygen? Do you believe in electrons? And what people will say is yes, and if you ask them why, what's the quote-unquote epistemic basis for their belief, they'll say, well, that's what my teacher said, that's what my parents say, that's what everybody says. So what people tend to cite as the authority for scientific concepts tends to be other people, not the scientific method. They don't, in some sense, we went the direction we went because we recognize that it's not so much that people disbelieve that they understand the scientific method, they think scientists don't follow it, or they misunderstand the scientific method. It's actually deeper than that. They don't even think of the scientific method. And in fact, the point of Andrew Schulman's work was that the epistemic basis for people's belief in scientific concepts was actually pretty much the same epistemic basis for their belief in supernatural concepts like ghosts or karma or reincarnation. That is, what did people around me say? And so in some sense, what the research suggests is something of a surprise, which is that when people think about scientists, they don't think of science. They don't think about the data, and they don't think about the rules. It's just something that never comes to mind. That's why it shows up in a section on hypocognition. People just don't have that idea ready to go, if you will.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm curious with the concept of hyper and hypocognition, how to think of a framework, how it applies to problems with a definite versus indefinite time horizon. And so by that, I mean that, if you don't know that annualized credit is not a term, there's no point in time dependency on that. Whereas, if you're holding Bitcoin in Q4 2017, every day your decision to do that is looking better and better until it's not. And so how should I think about that? What's the framework?
I don't know. Oh no, I'm hypocognitive on the idea of time frame. So I guess I would say it's a question to contemplate because in some sense, when dealing with clients, and education is beginning to realize this in terms of dealing with students, one shouldn't assume that clients or students are empty vessels of knowledge. They actually do have some sort of notions, some sort of ideas about how things are supposed to happen. And in education, it's becoming quite apparent that a lot of students, the barrier that they have to learning are misconceptions they have about the physical world or the biological world or the social world that prevent them from learning how things really work. So, for example, in psychology, it's still quite common for people to believe that you only use 10% of your brain. And that can't be true because the brain is such a calorie hog that you wouldn't develop an organ that would be that lazy and take that many calories. But people still believe it, and actually, or they believe that there are only 5 senses. And that active belief can be an impediment to actually learning about things like proprioception and stuff like that, that actually are part of human psychology. So I think the general, if there's a general point that I would make is that do think about when dealing with clients, not so much what they may not know, well, that is how they may be uninformed, rather think about ways they may be misinformed, because that turns out often to be the circumstance that's the most troubling. At least it's in experiments that I've seen, in case studies that I've seen, that's the case that really matters.
Given that, oh, one more.
So I just want to thank everybody. Professor, I was wondering, so you have a room full of investment managers that deploy investment strategies and are people who invest with those managers. And what is the probability or what % of these people are overconfident in their ability to make these decisions?
Well, I will give you a number, but before I give you the number, my upper bound will be 0 to 100%, which I'm sure has an 80% chance of actually capturing the true value. And I think I'll leave my response to that.
Nice.
Okay, so given that, maybe we'll thank the panelists.